Hello, welcome to Psych 105, Introduction to Psychology. Today we're going to be discussing mood disorders. So, mood disorders are prolonged and disturbed emotional states that affect almost all of a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The one that most of us are familiar with is major depressive disorder, and it is marked by at least 2 weeks of continually being in a bad mood, having no interest in anything, and getting no pleasure from activities. To be diagnosed, the person should have 4 of the following symptoms: problems with eating, problems with sleeping, problems with thinking, problems with concentrating, problems making decisions, lacking energy, thinking about suicide, which we call suicidal ideation, and feeling worthless or guilty. The picture I have here is of a giant black dog looming over a person. Winston Churchill, who was the leader of the United Kingdom during World War II, suffered terribly from depression, and he called it the Black Dog. And it became oftentimes known in various literatures as the Black Dog. So if you ever hear that expression, you know what it means. There is also persistent depressive disorder, which is characterized by being chronically, but not continually depressed for a period of at least 2 years. The person experiences at least 2 of the following: poor appetite, insomnia, fatigue, low self-esteem, poor concentration, and feelings of hopelessness. Depression impacts 6 million Americans each year in terms of being diagnosed. 16% of the adult population report at least 1 episode of major depressive disorder in their lifetime. That is 1 in 6, give or take. Depression occurs in women more than men by a 2-to-1 ratio. However, it is hypothesized that men are less likely to seek help and are more likely to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. Approximately 6% of Americans manage persistent depressive disorder, and the average age of onset is age 30. The biological causes of a depressive disorder are 3 different focuses. One is our neurotransmitter levels: serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine to some extent, or a reduced number of the receptor cells that absorb the serotonin or norepinephrine. Abnormal brain structures, areas that play a significant role in depression, or are the amygdala, the thalamus, and the hippocampus, which is smaller in depressed individuals. And again, you have your hippocampus, your amygdala, and your thalamus is over here. Genetic components that may predispose or put someone at risk for developing a depressive disorder. The more we learn, the more we realize that depression does tend to run in families. Psychosocial causes of depression include personality traits. Sometimes people just can't deal with their life. They have issues. Cognitive styles. Some people, again, are unable to process what is happening to them, so they shut down. Social support. The more social support we have, the less likely we are to deal with depressive disorders. Parental factors. And this is where a lot of our parents teach us how to cope. And these coping skills are learned. And if you learn that when the going gets tough, the tough go hide in their closet or go to bed, that becomes a way of dealing with stress. Being easily overwhelmed by daily stressors. And then a significant triggering life event, for example, the death of a spouse, the death of a child. You know, when you have a significant triggering life event, in a situation like that, oftentimes depression will last a very finite period of time, 6, 7, 8 months. There is, medication, there's therapy, and people will find that they are bouncing back. Other times, it can take much, much longer. It depends on the situation. Treating depressive disorder is a two-pronged approach, usually. Antidepressant drugs, the most popular, of course, are SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they act by increasing the levels of a specific group of neurotransmitters, and again, usually serotonin, but it can also include norepinephrine and or dopamine, which are involved in the regulation of emotions and moods. So, to think about this in a practical way, imagine the serotonin bathing your brain to make your mood more balanced. Now, in somebody who's depressed, instead of getting the full dose, you might only be getting a quarter dose or a half a dose of the amount of serotonin that your body should be making. Well, what the SSRI does is it prevents your brain from absorbing it too quickly, so that the serotonin that is available is more slowly absorbed so that it bathes your brain and the receptor cells in a more fluid, balanced way. Additionally, there are situations where you don't have as many receptor cells as you should, and in that case, again, you deal with a situation where that slowing down of the absorption rate will allow the fewer receptor cells to absorb the serotonin. So the idea here is to balance the amount of serotonin that your body is making. And along with that, one usually goes to psychotherapy to, talk about their issues, find out what the crisis is that's causing this, or if there is a lifestyle change. A lot of times when we've learned how to be depressed from our parents, for example, we need to learn new coping skills. In some cases, when depression is a long-term problem and medication is not helping, we move into electric convulsive therapy, or ECT, which involves placing electrodes on the skull and administering a mild electric current that passes through the brain and causes a seizure. Now, for those of you who have seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where he gets electric shock treatment and it looks brutal and horrifying, it's not like that anymore. It's still, as you can see from the picture, you're getting electrical currents, you have a mouth guard, but it's very specific to certain areas of the brain, because we know there are certain areas that create that depressive mood. So the treatment consists of 10 to 12 sessions, about 3 per week, and the serious side effect of electroconvulsive therapy is memory loss. But for people who are so depressed that they're considering suicide, this is an option for them that can and will and has been shown to be very effective to minimize the symptoms of depression. Moving into some of the other depressive disorders that are not quite as life debilitating, seasonal affective disorder, otherwise known as SAD, is when people become depressed when the number of sunny days decrease, such as in the fall and winter, and they recover at the arrival of spring and summer. To be diagnosed with seasonal affective disorder, people must meet full criteria for major depression, but it coincides with specific seasons, specifically usually appearing in the winter months for at least 2 years in a row. So 9 months of the year, you are as happy as a clam, no problems, but from January to April, you go through this deep, dark depression. Well, in that case, it would be an appropriate diagnosis for you. So why do some people have seasonal affective disorder and others don't? Well, basically, it's 3 primary causes. 1, people who suffer from seasonal affective disorder may produce less vitamin D than the average person. They may also have deficits regulating the amount of serotonin that the brain can distribute. And again, we go back to that idea of balancing our serotonin levels. And if you think of it in the same way as a diabetic who has to manage their insulin levels, there's not an issue about buck up, pull up your socks, put on your big girl panties, and get on with your day. It's really a matter of a chemical in your body is not being distributed to the way it should be. And that's why it's so important that if you recognize any of these symptoms in yourself or someone you love, that they seek help, because it's not something you can just get over by snapping out of it. People with seasonal affective disorder may overproduce the hormone melatonin. Darkness increases the production of melatonin, which regulates sleep. As winter days become shorter, melatonin production increases, leaving people with seasonal affective disorder to feel sleepier and more lethargic, often with delayed circadian rhythms. Our circadian rhythms are the internal clock. So for some people who get up every morning at a certain time to go to work, even on the weekends, we wake up at that time because our internal clock wakes us up. It says it's time to get up. And when we have, when the clocks change and fall back and spring forward, we get all messed up. We treat seasonal affective disorder in a variety of ways. The most popular way is light boxes. Research has found that the majority of those suffering from seasonal affective disorder experience relief solely from the regular use of light boxes. These emit high intensities of light, 2,500 to 10,000 lux, as compared to a normal light fixture that emits 250 to 500 lux, and produce similar effects to the sun's natural rays. It works because light restricts the secretion of melatonin in the brain. You're basically fooling your brain, and it's stopping the production of melatonin. And there's a picture of a light box with a woman reading a book at the lower right-hand corner of this slide. Aerobic exercise outside in the cold for 1 hour. That is something that if you can deal with the cold, can be very, very beneficial. In the winter, you should reduce your intake of sugar and carbs. Complex carbs are okay, but we're talking about things like donuts, Pop-Tarts, all those carbs that taste so good but are so bad. Sticking to the 8-hour sleep schedule. If you go to bed at 11, you get up at 7. If you go to bed at midnight, you get up at 8. Short-term course of antidepressants. And again, these antidepressants are there to balance your serotonin levels. Moving on, postpartum depression. This is a mood disorder that can affect women after childbirth. And a lot of people don't know this, but it has been shown to affect men also. About 10% of the people who suffer from postpartum depression are men. So even though women are the vast majority, it has been seen in men. Mothers with postpartum depression experience feelings of extreme sadness, anxiety, and exhaustion that make it difficult for them to complete daily care activities for themselves or for others. And, the common symptoms, changing in your sleep pattern, which with an infant is mandatory. Every 2 hours you are up feeding that baby. Unbelievable anger and rage over little things. And then the next minute you're crying and sad. You can't concentrate, you're not hungry, or you just want to eat everything. And then there's all that anxiety. And especially if you're the first-time parent, you have anxiety about everything. You're writing down how often the baby poops, how often the baby eats, how often the baby sleeps. You're neurotic anyway. So a lot of these symptoms are part and parcel of becoming a new parent, but when they're taken to the extreme, and that's the point you have to remember. So what causes it? Well, it results from a combination of physical and emotional factors. It does not occur because of something a mother does or does not do. And we love to beat up on moms, and there's a lot of mom shaming on the internet, and we want to get rid of that idea completely. After childbirth, the levels of hormones, estrogen and progesterone, in a woman's body quickly drops. Like just whoosh. This leads to chemical changes in her brain that may trigger mood swings and postpartum depression. Additionally, many mothers are unable to get the rest they need to fully recover from giving birth. Constant sleep deprivation can lead to physical discomfort and exhaustion, which can contribute to the symptoms of postpartum depression. Sleep deprivation over the long term can literally make you lose your mind. It has been shown that it works in much the same way as something along the lines of being intoxicated by alcohol. It is a way of changing and altering your perception of the world. So, that sleep deprivation is a big deal. How do we treat it? Well, antidepressants are not a good option if you are breastfeeding. So there are few studies that demonstrate that there's very few studies that demonstrate the effect of babies with antidepressants in the breast milk. So generally, if a woman has to go on antidepressants due to postpartum depression, they do not recommend she breastfeed. However, they do recommend psychological therapeutic interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy and counseling between the mother and her partner. So, dad comes home or her partner comes home and they don't help out too much. They don't get up in the middle of the night. Mom feels alone and abandoned. This is where some of the depression might come from. Additionally, when you're thinking about the idea of how serious this can be, several years ago, or actually probably closer to 15 or 20 years ago, a woman drowned 5 of her children in a bathtub. She was suffering from postpartum depression. Her husband had them living in a school bus with no running water and no electricity. The purpose was to get back to nature. Well, he ignored all of the signs and symptoms, and she ended up going to prison. Well, once she was convicted of murder, a lawyer who saw what happened got involved and said, this woman is suffering from a mental disorder. And then it was appealed, and now she was still guilty of what she did, but now she's in a mental institution getting help for her problem. And of course, once she realized what she had done, all she wanted to do was kill herself. So, this is a very serious situation that has to be regarded with the gravitas that it is deserved. So now we're going to move into bipolar disorder. And this is also known as manic depressive illness. It's no longer called that, but back in the day it used to be called that. It's a brain disorder that causes unusual shifts in mood, energy, activity levels, and the ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. Symptoms involve clear changes in mood, energy, and activity levels. These moods range from periods of extremely up and elated and energized behavior known as manic episodes to very sad, down, or hopeless periods known as depressive episodes. 4.4% of people in the United States are diagnosed with this condition. That's 1 in 25, so it's not that rare. This quote over here on the right is very indicative of what happens to somebody who is dealing with bipolar disorder. Don't believe everything you think, because when you're going through a manic episode, everything that's racing through your mind is not realistic. You have problems understanding reality. Bipolar I disorder is defined by manic episodes that last at least 7 days, or by manic symptoms that are so severe that the person needs immediate hospital care. Why do they last at least 7 days? Well, think about it. The symptoms of mania include elevated mood, inflated self-esteem, decreased need for sleep, and that's the one. You can only go so long without sleep before your body collapses. Racing thoughts, difficulty maintaining attention, increase in goal-directed activity, and excessive involvement in pleasurable activities. Oftentimes, people with bipolar disorder will engage in activities such as spending money that they don't have. They'll go out and blow $5,000 on clothes that they don't need and they don't have the money for. Or they engage in sexual activities that they normally wouldn't engage in when they're in their right mind. But getting back to the 7 days thing in sleep, imagine how exhausted you are after you go a day or two without sleep. Your brain is literally like, what? I need to go to sleep now. Well, go 5-6 days. You're literally going into a psychotic episode where you don't know what's real and what's not real. And that's the issue with mania. Because at that point, your brain has no longer developed a sense of reality. It is working exclusively on its own sense of id, in a sense. Its own desires, its own wants. The superego is asleep. Usually, depressive episodes occur as well, typically lasting at least 2 weeks. Episodes of depression with mixed features, i.e. having depression and manic symptoms at the same time, are also possible. You also have people who are rapid cyclers. They go from depression to mania within a few days. But most people, they go through depression, go back to normal, then they go to mania, go back to depression, then they come back up to normal for a while. And I have a chart later that'll explain that. So let's talk about mania in a little more detail. In order for a manic episode to be diagnosed, 3 or more of the following symptoms must be present. Inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. I am the best at this. Decreased need for sleep, so you might only close your eyes for a couple hours. More talkative than usual or a pressure to keep talking. Flight of ideas or subjective experience that thoughts are racing. Attention is easily drawn to unimportant or irrelevant items. Increase in goal-directed activity, either socially, at work or school, or sexually, or psychomotor agitation. Excessive involvement in pleasurable activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. For example, engaging in unrestrained buying sprees, sexual indiscretion, or foolish business investments. Moving into bipolar II disorder is defined by a pattern of depressive episodes and hypomanic episodes lasting at least 4 days, but not the full-blown manic episodes described above. So, in a sense, hypomania is like mania light. It is usually not severe enough to impair functioning or require hospitalization. And on the right, you see the chart of severe mania to severe depression. Some people get extremely irritable and even angry during hypomanic phases. They become very disassociative and disconnected from the world around them. They feel constantly bombarded by thoughts they can't control and obsessed with fragments of music or literature that repeat endlessly in their mind. So here's the chart I was talking about. So bipolar 1, and that's the purple, or more like burgundy, where you go from mania down to severe depression, and you go on your meds, usually when you are dealing with severe depression, and you start to feel better, and you're feeling really good, and then you go off your meds because now you're feeling fine, and that's the problem. People go off their meds when they start to feel fine, and they go back into a manic phase, which they love. Being manic is awesome for them, and they plunge right back into a depression. Bipolar 2, again, we see hypomania, not so high for that manic, but moving down into that severe depression again. The third type of bipolar that we're not discussing, cyclothymia, is hypomanic episodes alternate with depressive episodes that do not meet the criteria for major depression. The fourth type of bipolar is a non-specific bipolar that's usually caused by situational experiences in life. So let's talk about risk factors. Brain structure and functioning. MRI studies have shown that people with bipolar disorders have significant reductions in the volume of their whole brain and prefrontal lobe. So the brain just isn't as substantial as a normal brain. Also, the lateral ventricles are enlarged in the brain, meaning that the ventricles that carry the blood are bigger. Genetics are being studied, no clear connection yet. Substance abuse, traumatic brain injury, and stress have been associated with the onset of bipolar disorder. And it's an inherited issue. First-degree relatives, siblings, children. So if you have bipolar disorder, there's a good chance you could pass it along to your children. Here is a series of PET scans that demonstrate depression. In the first one on the left, a little bit of yellow in the front, that's kind of activity, but the rest of the brain is pretty quiet. Then the manic state the next day, look at that red and yellow, that's all that electrical energy just bouncing around. And then a week later, 9 days later, you'll see that there is again a severe depression at this point with the small amount of yellow, tiny amount of yellow that's available. That's the electrical signals that are being given off in the brain. So, treating it. Medications generally used to treat bipolar disorder include mood stabilizers such as lithium, atypical antipsychotics, which we discussed in detail in the PowerPoint on schizophrenia, antidepressants, and sleep aids. Sleep aids are used especially when people are in a hypomanic or manic phase. Psychotherapy, electroconvulsive therapy when medications are not being helping that much, and then keeping a life chart that records daily mood, symptoms, sleep patterns, and life events. This is a really effective thing, and actually they have apps now that you can utilize to record your mood and sleep patterns and life issues that anyone can download. A lot of them are free, and they help you track where you are and if there's any trends. And and that's really part of the issue, is looking for triggers that might cause a manic episode or a severe depression. So before we finish today, I wanted to talk about suicide, because suicide is a major consequence of mental disorders. And when we think about depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, any of the ones we've talked about this week, we have to also address the fact that suicide is very common. In 2014, 42,773 deaths by suicide in the United States, which was the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. Based on information from the CDC, it is estimated of that 43,000, 38,000 of them were related to a mental disorder. That is a staggering number. Every day, 105 Americans commit suicide. So who are most at risk for suicide? Number 1, men. Again, we briefly addressed how women are more likely to seek help. Men are more likely to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs. And we're going to talk about why men are more likely to commit suicide in the next couple of slides. Adolescence. And we know adolescence, your brain is still a work in progress. You take things very seriously, and you do not have perspective yet. Whites, Caucasians, and Native Americans. Native Americans have a very high rate of alcoholism, and they have been discriminated against in this country, in the United States, since we showed up. So there's not a lot of help out there for them, and the help that has been provided is relatively new. So some more suicide statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. 250,000 people a year are suicide survivors, meaning they tried to kill themselves, it just didn't work. 1 in 25 suicide attempts is successful. 79% of successful U.S. suicides are men. Women tend to have more suicidal thoughts, but they usually try to kill themselves with poison or an overdose, which has a lower rate of working. Women are most likely to kill themselves between the ages of 45 and 54. Men tend to use firearms, which tend to be much more effective in terms of committing suicide. So a woman might take a handful of pills, and pills are coated with a material that will make them throw up if they take too many. The gun, on the other hand, they put it in their mouth, they put it against their temple. That's going to work no matter what. And in the unlikely event that it won't work, men will oftentimes have a backup plan where they will hang themselves or they will try something else. Men are more likely to kill themselves after the age of 75. And they usually do so because they're widowed or divorced and they don't want to be alone, and they're not looking to marry some young girl to look after them, because young girls don't want to marry someone who is not rich. So oftentimes they are without hope, and as such they have access to a handgun or a shotgun, and it's very easy to kill yourself, especially if you're drunk or high. At a hospital, our coroner's office, they will do a psychological autopsy on suicide victims. And these include looking at the hospital records and interviews with the decedent's friends and family. And these are conducted to determine if there is a specific reason why the person committed suicide. And often there is a high incidence of mental disorders, especially depression. And the issue is, and going back to elderly men, if you think about the men today who are 75, these are men who fought in the Korean War or the Vietnam War. Their fathers fought in World War II. These were men who were taught to keep their pain inside, to be tough, and they were never taught to deal or cope with their stress. So if they're suffering from a biological problem like a lack of serotonin receptors, they don't understand that they can get pharmaceutical help. Instead, they would rather put a gun in their mouth. So we have to be very conscious of the fact that suicide and mental disorders are problems that can be identified before they even happen. So, how can we reduce the number of suicides? It is estimated that 50 to 75% of suicides could be prevented if depression and mental disorders were managed or addressed more effectively. 75% of suicide victims had visited their primary care physician in the 12 months prior to their suicide. And if you think about older people, they spend a lot of time at doctors' offices. Older people, especially older men, they have problems with their prostate, they may have problems with their heart, they may have cancer, and they're at a doctor's office. And yet, the primary care physician may not be looking for signs of depression. 33% of suicide victims had contact with a mental health specialist in the 12 months prior to their suicide. That is even more frightening. Research demonstrates that the ER is the best first intervention point. Post-ER visits, these individuals are 6 times more likely than the average person to kill themselves. The World Health Organization has conducted research that demonstrates that a 10-part follow-up post-ER visit will reduce the chances of the individual committing suicide by 1,100%. That's a staggering improvement. But think about it, a 10-part follow-up post-ER visit. That's a lot of manpower and a lot of time. And that is where the problem lies. It is an expensive proposition to reduce suicide numbers, but it's possible. And the research is out there demonstrating that it can be done. It's just a matter of convincing politicians, the people who put the money that they collect in taxes in the right places, and making sure things are being done. If you think about how many veterans commit suicide every day, and you think about the mess that the veterans' hospitals are in, that'll tell you right there that these recommendations are not being followed. So it's a matter of applying scientific research to these social issues. However, the problem often lies with politicians who don't believe science. So, back on the soapbox, get your politicians to believe in science. Write letters, send emails, and elect people who understand the importance of science. I'm getting off my soapbox. Anyway, that's it for today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or text me. If you're not in my class, please leave a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much and have a great day.